Snowflakes drifted outside the towering windows of Harris and White Realty, blurring the city skyline in soft white. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was sharp and heavy with ambition. Andrea Wilson sat at the edge of a leather chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Across the table sat Alfred White, the man whose name carried more weight in New York real estate than any building he had ever sold. His hair was silver and slicked back, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't waste words on pleasantries. "This is the biggest opportunity you've had," Alfred said, tapping a manila folder on the polished table. "Close this deal before Christmas Eve, and you'll prove you belong here. Fail, and you'll regret it." Andrea straightened her blazer and forced her voice to remain steady. "What deal?" "The Walker Ranch," Alfred replied. 3 generations, thousands of acres in Wyoming. Untouched, pristine. My buyers want it. They're ready to pay well above market value. But the owner, Ethan Walker, refuses to sell. He hides behind sentimental talk about family and legacy. Andrea reached for the folder and opened it. Photographs showed rolling fields blanketed in snow, a worn wooden fence, and a rustic house that looked carved out of time. The place radiated history and something else, something she couldn't name. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Alfred leaned forward. "Convince him. That's what you do best. Get him to sign before Christmas Eve." Her brows lifted. "That's less than 2 weeks away." "Exactly," Alfred said. "The buyers want to close out the year with this announcement. If you succeed, there's a 6-figure bonus waiting, and a promotion. If you fail..." He let the words hang in the air like a blade. Andrea swallowed, her pulse quickening. "I'll get it done." That evening, back in her apartment, she laid an open suitcase on the bed. Outside her window, New York glittered with Christmas lights, but she felt no warmth from them. She tried to focus on packing, but her thoughts drifted to the folder and the man whose land stood between her and everything she had worked for. She picked up her phone and called her sister. Amanda answered with a smile in her voice. "Andrea, finally. Tell me you're coming home for Christmas this year." Andrea hesitated. "I don't think I can. I've been sent on a big assignment." Amanda sighed. "Of course, work always comes first with you. But Christmas isn't about contracts. It's about family." Andrea closed her eyes. "This deal is different, Amanda. It could change my entire future." Her sister's tone softened. "Just don't lose yourself chasing it. Success means nothing if it costs you who you are." Andrea ended the call with a promise to try, though she knew she couldn't keep it. The following morning, the train carried her west. The steel and glass of Manhattan gave way to open land, blanketed in snow and silence. She read Ethan Walker's file again and again. Rancher, widower, father, stubborn, a man tied to the land by more than just property lines. "Everyone has a price," she whispered to herself. "I just need to find his." But the words didn't sound as convincing as usual. By the time she reached the Wyoming town, dusk had fallen. Christmas lights glowed warmly on the main street, and the air smelled of pine and smoke. Andrea rented a pickup truck and drove through winding roads, the snowfall growing heavier until a wooden sign appeared in her headlights. Walker Ranch. She slowed as the ranch house came into view, its windows glowing against the dark night. For a moment, she sat in the truck, staring. It didn't look like a deal to be made. It looked like a home. The front door opened, and a man stepped outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a flannel shirt beneath his coat. His boots crunched in the snow as he walked toward her, his presence steady and unyielding. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep and guarded. Andrea pulled her coat tighter and stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, my name is Andrea Wilson. I'd like to talk to you about your property." He studied her for a long moment, his expression hard. Then he shook his head slowly, almost with pity. "You must be from the city," he said. "Let me save you the trouble. I'm not selling, not now, not ever." Andrea froze, Caught off guard by his bluntness, Ethan Walker turned back toward the door, his words carrying through the cold air. "If you think you can change my mind, you're in for one hell of a fight." The next morning, Andrea woke to the sound of howling wind. Snow pounded against the windows of the small inn where she had spent the night, the storm rolling across the plains like a living thing. She dressed quickly, layered against the cold, and made her way back to the truck. The roads were coated in white, but she pressed forward, determined not to let the weather intimidate her. By the time she reached Walker Ranch, the storm had calmed to a steady fall of thick flakes. The house looked even more imposing in the daylight, its timber walls worn by decades of wind and snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the faint smell of wood and something warm cooking inside. Andrea knocked on the heavy front door, and it creaked open to reveal a girl of about 8 years old, her cheeks pink from the warmth of the fire. She blinked up at Andrea with curious brown eyes. "Hi," Andrea said, softening her voice. "You must be Sophie." The girl nodded slowly. "Who are you?" "I'm Andrea. I wanted to talk to your dad." Before Sophie could answer, a deeper voice cut in from behind her. "I told you last night, I'm not selling." Ethan appeared in the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. His tone was sharp, but his daughter's presence softened the edge of it. Andrea stood straighter. "I know what you said, but I'd still like a chance to explain why I'm here." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You came all the way out here from the city, didn't you? Let me guess, you think you can flash big numbers in front of me until I cave. I think you might at least want to hear what I have to offer," Andrea replied evenly. He stepped forward, pulling the door closed behind him so Sophie wouldn't hear. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed his arms. "Listen carefully. This land isn't just dirt and timber. It's my family's blood. My father built this ranch. My grandfather before him. Selling it would be like selling their graves." Andrea's breath caught at the raw conviction in his voice, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I respect that. But the truth is, no matter how much history this land holds, the world is changing. Developers can turn this place into something that supports hundreds of jobs, brings in money for the town." He cut her off, his voice low and firm. "The world might be changing, but that doesn't mean I have to sell my soul to keep up with it." The tension between them hung in the icy air. Andrea pressed her lips together, weighing her next words carefully. She had been trained to dismantle objections, to find cracks in the armor of even the toughest clients. But Ethan's armor wasn't made of fear or greed, it was made of loyalty, of something unshakable. "I'm not asking you to betray your family," Andrea said finally. "I'm asking you to think about your daughter's future. About what happens if this ranch becomes too much to manage." For the first time, something flickered in Ethan's eyes. A hesitation, brief but visible. Andrea noticed, and a spark of hope ignited in her chest. But just as quickly, his expression hardened again. "You don't know me. You don't know my daughter. And you sure as hell don't know this land. You think you can just waltz in here, dressed in your city coat and your polished shoes, and tell me how to live. That's not how it works." Andrea felt the sting of his words, but she refused to back down. "I didn't come here to insult you. I came here because I believe there's a way this can work for both of us." Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "If you want to stay here, you'd better start learning how this place works. Otherwise, the snow will eat you alive." The door behind him opened again, and Sophie peeked out, her eyes wide with curiosity. Grace Walker, Ethan's mother, appeared too, her face lined with years of work, but softened by a kind smile. "Ethan," she said gently, "don't leave the poor girl standing out in the cold. Invite her in for breakfast." Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. He glanced at Andrea, then back at his mother. "Fine, but only for breakfast. Don't get too comfortable." Inside, the house was warm and alive with the scent of bacon and fresh bread. Sophie chattered as Andrea sat at the table, Grace placing a plate in front of her. For a moment, the atmosphere softened. as if Andrea were simply a guest rather than an intruder. But Ethan remained standing, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her, with a warning she couldn't ignore. Andrea smiled faintly, lifting a fork. "Thank you for having me." Grace returned the smile. "Any friend is welcome at this table. Even a stranger can become family if you give them a chance." Andrea caught the way Ethan's jaw tightened at his mother's words, but he said nothing. Instead, he stepped outside again, leaving Andrea at the table with Sophie and Grace. As the fire crackled in the hearth, and Sophie giggled at some small joke, Andrea felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the weight of her mission, because outside, Ethan Walker stood under the falling snow, staring across the vast land that he refused to let go of, his mind already set against her. And Andrea realized that convincing him might not just cost her career, if she failed it might cost her something far deeper. The storm carried on through the night, and by morning the ranch was blanketed in a heavy silence. Andrea woke in the small guest room Grace had offered her after breakfast, though it had been made clear by Ethan that the arrangement was temporary. The window rattled in the wind, and outside, the world was painted white. She dressed quickly, pulling on her coat, and stepped into the hallway. The house was already alive with the sound of footsteps, voices, and the creak of wood. Downstairs, Grace hummed softly as she stirred something on the stove, the smell of coffee filling the air. Sophie sat at the table, coloring on a piece of paper, her small hands smudged with pencil marks. Andrea hesitated before entering, feeling like an intruder. Sophie looked up first, her face lighting with curiosity. "Are you staying here now?" the girl asked. Andrea smiled softly. "Only for a little while." Sophie tilted her head. "Do you know how to ride horses?" The question caught Andrea off guard. "Not really," she admitted. Sophie giggled, covering her mouth. "Then you're going to have a hard time here." Grace glanced over her shoulder with a knowing smile. Sophie's right. Life on a ranch isn't easy, but you'll learn fast enough if you're willing to try. Andrea nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. She had spent her life in high heels and subways, not boots and saddles. The back door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He stopped short when he saw Andrea at the table, his jaw tightening. "You're still here." Grace frowned at him. "Where else is she supposed to go in weather like this? You can't just send her back to town in a blizzard." Ethan's eyes locked on Andrea. "This isn't a hotel. And you're not here for vacation. If you're staying, you'll work like everyone else." Andrea met his gaze evenly, refusing to flinch. "Fine. Tell me what to do." A shadow of surprise crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. "All right then. You can start with the barn. The horses need feeding." The barn was colder than she expected, the air filled with the earthy smell of hay and animals. Ethan handed her a pitchfork and pointed to the bales stacked against the wall. Andrea tried to lift one, but it was heavier than she imagined. She stumbled, nearly dropping it, and Ethan shook his head with a low chuckle. "You're going to get yourself buried under the hay before you get one horse fed." Andrea shot him a glare. "I said I'd try. I didn't say I'd be perfect at it." Sophie appeared at the door, bundled in her coat, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Want me to show you how?" Andrea hesitated, then laughed softly. "I think I need all the help I can get." Together, she and Sophie dragged the bales into the stalls, feeding the horses. Andrea's arms ached, her coat was covered in straw, and her hair stuck to her face, but she couldn't help laughing at the mess of it all. For the first time since arriving, she felt a little less like an outsider. From the corner of the barn, Ethan watched silently. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Andrea longer than he intended. The sound of her laughter filled the space, mixing with Sophie's giggles, and for a moment, something stirred in him he hadn't felt in years. When Andrea caught him staring, she raised a brow. "What?" "Surprised I haven't given up yet." Ethan cleared his throat and turned away. "Don't get too comfortable. This isn't a game. You'll be gone soon enough." The words were sharp, but Andrea heard the hesitation buried inside them. That evening, they all sat around the fireplace. Grace knitted quietly, Sophie curled up with a book, and Andrea sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the room glowed with warmth. Ethan sat across from her, his face half in shadow, his eyes fixed on the flames. Andrea studied him silently. He carried himself with a weight that seemed heavier than the ranch itself. There was strength in him, yes, but also something else, sonic, buried too deep to name. Breaking the silence, Sophie looked up at Andrea. "Do you miss your family at Christmas?" Andrea blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, I do." "Then why aren't you with them?" Andrea hesitated, her throat tightening. She thought of Amanda, of the phone call, of the way her sister's voice had softened with disappointment. "Because sometimes, work gets in the way." Sophie frowned. "That doesn't sound very fun." Andrea forced a small smile. "No, it isn't." Ethan shifted in his chair, his gaze flicking toward Andrea for the briefest moment, but he said nothing. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the house had grown quiet, Andrea lay awake in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling. She had expected resistance, but not this. Not the warmth of Grace, not the openness of Sophie, not the strange, guarded pull she felt toward Ethan. She turned to the window. Snow still fell across the endless fields, silent and relentless. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse neighed, breaking the stillness. Andrea pressed a hand against her chest, her heart unsteady. She was supposed to be here to close a deal, nothing more. But already, the lines were beginning to blur. And for the first time, she wondered if she had stepped into something far more dangerous than a negotiation. The storm eased the next morning, leaving the ranch draped in untouched white. The world outside the windows looked like a painting, the fields glittering beneath the pale sun. Andrea stepped into her boots with a sigh, already bracing herself for another day of chores. Her muscles ached from the barn work, but she wasn't about to let Ethan think she couldn't handle it. In the kitchen, Grace was setting out breakfast. The scent of biscuits and coffee filled the air. Sophie sat at the table, swinging her legs as she chattered about Christmas decorations she wanted to hang around the house. Ethan came in last, brushing snow from his shoulders. His eyes flicked briefly to Andrea, before settling on his plate. "We'll need to check the fence along the north pasture today," he said. "Cattle won't stay where they should if it's down." Andrea glanced up. "I'll come with you." He raised a brow. "It's a 4-hour ride, maybe longer. Not exactly city work." "I'll manage," she replied firmly. Grace smiled faintly into her coffee, and Sophie grinned at Andrea, as if she had just won some invisible contest. Ethan muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. By mid-morning, Andrea found herself astride a horse named Jasper, following Ethan across the wide expanse of snow. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the silence of the land was almost peaceful. She had never seen so much open space, stretching endlessly until the horizon seemed to fold into the sky. "You're riding like you're afraid the ground might swallow you," Ethan called over his shoulder. "I'm just making sure I don't fall," Andrea shot back. He smirked, though he kept his gaze ahead. "Don't worry. Jasper knows the land better than you ever will." They rode in silence for a while, the crunch of hooves on snow the only sound. Finally, Andrea cleared her throat. "Why are you so determined not to sell? Most people would take the money and start fresh somewhere else." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He guided his horse over a small hill before responding. "Because this place isn't just dirt and fences. My father died out here, working this land until the end. My grandfather built this house with his own hands. Every inch of this ranch holds their sweat, their sacrifice. Selling it would be like erasing them." Andrea listened, her chest tightening. She had read about his family in the file, but hearing it in his voice gave it a weight she hadn't expected. "I understand loyalty," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes sharp. "Do you? Or is loyalty just another word you use when it's convenient for your job? The sting of his words caught her off guard. You think you know me, but you don't. Then tell me, he challenged. Why did you choose this line of work? Why spend your life chasing contracts instead of living it? Andrea fell silent. She wasn't used to anyone asking her that, not sincerely. Anyway, she looked out across the snow, her voice quieter when she spoke again. Because when you grow up watching your parents struggle, you start to believe that money is the only way to make sure you'll never lose everything. I wanted security. I wanted control. Ethan's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. And has it given you what you wanted? Andrea hesitated, then shook her head. Not really. For a moment, the air between them shifted, heavy with something unspoken. Ethan looked away, urging his horse forward. Then maybe you're chasing the wrong thing. They reached the broken section of fence and worked together to mend it. Andrea's hands grew numb from the cold, but Ethan's quiet guidance steadied her. Every so often, their hands brushed when passing tools, and each time, Andrea felt a spark she didn't want to acknowledge. By the time they finished, the sun was sinking low, painting the snow in shades of gold and blue. As they rode back toward the house, Andrea caught Ethan watching her again. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. That evening, after dinner, Andrea found herself by the fireplace with Grace. The older woman's knitting needles clicked softly as she spoke. You remind me of someone I used to know, Grace said, her eyes never leaving her work. Andrea tilted her head. Who? My late daughter-in-law, Ethan's wife, Claire. She was stubborn too, strong, never afraid to speak her mind. He loved her fiercely. Grace's voice softened. Losing her broke something in him. Sometimes I wonder if he'll ever let anyone close again. Andrea's throat tightened. How did she die? Grace sighed. An accident. It's been years, but grief doesn't obey the calendar. Some days, it feels like yesterday for him. Andrea looked toward the doorway, where Ethan's shadow stretched across the hall. She thought of the guarded way he looked at her, the weight in his voice when he spoke of the land, the way his walls seemed built not only around his ranch but around his heart. Later that night, Andrea stepped outside. The air was crisp, the stars sharp against the dark sky. She wrapped her coat tighter and gazed out at the snow, stretching endlessly into the night. Her breath hung in the air, mingling with the silence. Footsteps crunched behind her. She turned to find Ethan, his face shadowed in the moonlight. You'll freeze out here, he said quietly. I just needed some air. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was different, this time not hostile, but charged with something she couldn't name. Andrea glanced at him, her heart unsteady. For a moment, she thought he might step closer, close the distance between them. His gaze lingered on her lips, his breath visible in the cold. But then he looked away sharply, stepping back. Don't get the wrong idea. Whatever you think is happening, here it isn't. He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Andrea standing in the snow, her pulse racing. And she realized that beneath Ethan Walker's stubbornness and silence, there were secrets buried deeper than the snow itself, and, if she wasn't careful, she might lose herself trying to uncover them. The days at Walker Ranch began to blend into one another, a rhythm of cold mornings, heavy work, and quiet evenings by the fire. Andrea found herself growing used to the steady pace, though her body ached with every task Ethan handed her. She learned to feed the horses without stumbling, to haul water without spilling half of it, even to stack firewood, the way Ethan insisted was the only proper way. But no matter how much she tried to blend in, she never forgot why she was there. Each night, when the house fell quiet, she returned to her guest room and studied the papers tucked neatly inside her suitcase, the contract, the offer, the numbers that were supposed to tempt Ethan into surrendering his land. Every time she looked at them, guilt pricked at her. Sophie's laughter echoed in her ears. Grace's kindness replayed in her mind, and Ethan's guarded stare haunted her more than she cared to admit. One evening, as snow whipped against the windows, Andrea stepped into the hallway to take a call. She pressed her phone tightly to her ear, lowering her voice so no one would overhear. "Tell me you have good news," Alfred White demanded. Andrea closed her eyes, steadying her breath. "It's complicated. Complicated." Alfred's tone sharpened. "I gave you 2 weeks. That was generous. I expect results, Wilson. I don't care how stubborn this rancher is. Your job is to make him see reason." Andrea swallowed hard. It's not just about money for him. This ranch is everything. If I push too hard, he'll throw me out before I get anywhere. "Then don't push," Alfred snapped. "Persuade. Get close to him. Earn his trust. Do whatever it takes, but get that signature. If you fail, don't bother coming back." The line went dead. Andrea stood in the hallway, the phone still pressed against her ear, her stomach twisting. She had always prided herself on being professional, on keeping emotions out of business. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she could. She slipped the phone back into her pocket just as a voice came from behind her. "Who was that?" Andrea turned sharply. Ethan stood in the shadows, his expression unreadable. "Work," she said quickly. His eyes narrowed. "What kind of work calls you out here, in the middle of a storm?" Andrea forced a smile. "The kind that never really stops." Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if he could see straight through her. Finally, he shook his head. "City people. Always chasing something." He turned and walked away, but his suspicion lingered in the air long after he was gone. The next morning, Sophie came running into Andrea's room with a grin, waving a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. "Look what I found." Andrea's blood ran cold. Sophie held the contract, the one she had hidden in her suitcase. "Where did you get that?" Andrea asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "In your bag?" Sophie said innocently. "Is it important?" Before Andrea could answer, Ethan appeared in the doorway. His gaze dropped to the paper in Sophie's hands, and his entire body stiffened. "Give that to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Sophie handed it over quickly, sensing the tension. Ethan unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words. His jaw tightened with every line he read. Finally, he looked up at Andrea, his face dark with betrayal. "So this is what you've been doing here," he said. "Smiling at my daughter, sitting at my table, pretending you care, all while planning to take everything from us." Andrea's throat constricted. "It's not like that, don't," he snapped. "Don't stand there and lie to me." He crumpled the paper in his fist. "You think you can waltz into my home, charm my family, and trick me into selling the only thing I have left of them? You're no better than the rest of them." Andrea's eyes burned, but she forced the words out. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Yes, I came here for the deal, but I never pretended about Sophie, or Grace." Or she stopped herself before she said his name. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low, each word cutting. "You don't belong here. Pack your things and leave. Tonight." Andrea's chest ached, but she could see the fire in his eyes, the pain twisting behind his anger. Words tangled in her throat. She wanted to explain, to make him see that something had changed, that she wasn't the same woman who had arrived with a suitcase full of contracts. But before she could, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Sophie's wide eyes filled with confusion. "Why is Daddy so mad?" she whispered. Andrea forced a trembling smile. Sometimes grown-ups get upset about things they don't understand. But the truth was, Ethan understood perfectly. And Andrea knew she might have just lost the fragile trust she had worked so hard to build. That night, she sat alone in her room, the storm raging outside once again. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, the papers inside scattered like broken promises. She pressed her hands against her face, fighting the tears. For the first time in years, Andrea wasn't worried about her career, her promotion. or even the six-figure bonus Alfred had promised. What tore at her now was something far heavier, the thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Sophie's laughter and Grace's kindness, of leaving the man whose eyes burned into her, even when she closed her own. And as the storm howled outside, Andrea realized she was no longer sure which was worse, failing Alfred White and losing her job, or failing Ethan Walker and losing something she hadn't even known she wanted until now. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. Wind howled off the ridgeline, slamming into the house with a force that rattled window panes and sent a low moan through the rafters. Andrea stood in the guest room with her suitcase open, her hands hovering over clothes she couldn't seem to fold. Every movement felt heavy, slow, as if the storm outside had seeped beneath her skin and thickened the air around her. She zipped the suitcase halfway and stopped. Leaving should have been simple. Pack, drive, return to the world she understood. But downstairs she could hear Sophie's voice, bright and hopeful as it always was, and Grace's low murmur as she set the table. She could feel Ethan's anger like a heat in the house, radiating from the places he stood earlier, pooling in the hallway where he told her to go. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The name on the screen made her stomach clench. Alfred White. She answered with a whisper. "I can't talk right now." "You'd better," Alfred said, voice crisp as frost. "I don't have time for theatrics." "Where are we?" Andrea stared at the suitcase. "Worse than before." "What does that mean?" "He found the papers," she said. He thinks this was all a trick. Is he wrong?" Alfred's tone carried a flat impatience. "Your job is to secure signatures, not sympathies. If he's emotional, use that. Offer guarantees, community funds, legacy plaques, things that make sentimental people feel seen. But get it done." "There's a storm," Andrea said, aware of how weak it sounded. "I'm not leaving tonight." "Fine. Then fix it tonight. Because if I don't see forward movement by morning, I will send someone else. And you won't like what he does to that ranch or to your position here." He paused, letting the implications settle. "You wanted control, Andrea. Take it." The line went dead. Outside, a gust hit the window so hard she flinched. She slid the phone into her coat pocket and closed the suitcase with a final zip that sounded too much like defeat. When she stepped into the hall, Grace was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, wool sweater buttoned high at her throat, worry making her eyes look older than they were. "You'll stay the night," Grace said without preamble. "Roads are closing by the minute. Sheriff already called it. No one gets out until daylight, maybe later." "I don't want to cause trouble," Andrea said. Grace shook her head. "Storm's the trouble, not you." She lowered her voice. "Ethan's hurt. The anger isn't about you alone. It's about years of people coming here to take what they didn't build." Andrea swallowed. "I should have told him who I was the moment I arrived." "Maybe," Grace allowed. "Or maybe you needed to learn what this place is before you decided what to say." She reached for Andrea's hand. "Eat with us. Whatever comes after can come after." In the dining room, the table was simple stew, steaming in a heavy pot, fresh bread, still warm, butter curled in a small dish. Sophie sat up straighter when Andrea entered, a grin breaking free before she remembered her father's mood and smoothed it back down. Ethan took the seat opposite Andrea without meeting her eyes. The storm battered the house like it meant to get in. They ate in a silence shaped by unasked questions. Halfway through the meal, Sophie set down her spoon. "If Andrea has to leave tonight, can I at least show her the ornaments I made?" She looked between them, pleading with both, hopeful with neither. Ethan pressed his lips together, then nodded once. After we cleared the dishes, Sophie's relief burst into the room like sudden sunlight. She hopped down, collected bowls with exaggerated care, and darted to the sink. Grace stood to help, leaving Andrea and Ethan at the table with only the storm for company. Andrea set her spoon down. "I came to do a job," she said quietly. "I didn't plan on staying for breakfast, or learning to feed horses. Or, she searched for words that didn't turn too soft in the air. Or caring what happens here. Ethan's gaze lifted, flinty and bright. You don't get to say that like it absolves you. I'm not asking for absolution, she said. I'm asking to be heard. He leaned back, arms crossed, as if bracing. Say what you need to say. The offer is high. Too high, honestly. It comes with development guarantees for the town jobs, infrastructure upgrades, school support funds. I know what this land means to you, and maybe none of that matters. But I didn't come here to trick your mother or your daughter. I stayed because there's something about this place that makes sense in a way my life doesn't. She hesitated. And because you matter more than a signature ever should. He flinched, like she'd reached across the table and touched him. The storm hushed for a beat, or maybe it only seemed to. The last time I trusted a promise about this ranch, he said, voice low, a surveyor told my father he wouldn't touch the creek. We signed an easement for the utility line. They chewed up half the bank and left it to collapse. Took us years to fix. They called it an oversight. He tapped the table with 2 fingers, a habit that sounded like a clock. So no, I don't get moved by guarantees. I understand, Andrea said. But you don't have to trust a company. You could. The idea came as she spoke it, forming a shape she hadn't seen clearly until now. You could trust me. Ethan's laugh had no humor in it. That ship sailed when I pulled a contract out of my daughter's hands. I'll give you the truth you deserved from the start, Andrea said, trying to steady the tremor in her voice. My boss is pushing hard. There's a bonus waiting if I close by Christmas Eve. A big one. A promotion. It's what I've been chasing for years, she exhaled. And since I got here, none of it has felt as important as it used to. Grace re-entered then, drying her hands on a towel, sensing the faintest shift in the room's temperature. Sophie peeked around her hip, eyes bright again. Ornaments now. Ethan nodded. Ornaments. They moved to the living room, where a pine tree stood by the window, its branches heavy with memories. Sophie opened a tin and lifted out handmade stars cut from old magazines. A tiny felt horse stitched crookedly, a paper snowflake with the name Claire written in a child's wobbly letters. She held that one carefully, reverently, and Ethan's breath caught so softly, Andrea almost missed it. Mom made this with me when I was little, Sophie said, voice whispered thin. Andrea knelt beside her. It's beautiful. We hang it last, Sophie said. Dad says it belongs at the top. Ethan crossed to the window and looked out into the storm like it held answers he'd misplaced. Grace slipped the ornament back into its slot in the tin, eyes glistening with a sheen that wasn't from the lamp's glow. The house shuddered under a sudden gust. The lights flickered, dimmed, then died, plunging them into darkness. Sophie squealed, and then giggled, delighted and scared all at once. Grace moved with practiced ease to the sideboard, bringing out candles that filled the room with a soft, honeyed light. Generator? Grace asked. Stuck in town, Ethan said. I was supposed to pick it up today. He glanced at Andrea. I had other things on my mind. She felt that strike deeper than he intended. What do? We keep the fire fed, keep the pipes dripping, and we check the barn, Ethan said, already reaching for his coat. If the wind shifts, that north door can blow in. I'll come, Andrea said. You'll stay, he countered. Grace cut in. You'll take her, she told Ethan, tone leaving no room for argument. 2 pairs of hands are better. I'll keep Sophie warm. They stepped into the storm, the door wrenching in the wind as they forced it closed behind them. Snow seared their cheeks, the night a roaring white. Between the house and barn, distance stretched into something more like endurance. Andrea bowed her head and followed in Ethan's footsteps, boots driving deep, breath burning in her lungs. Inside the barn, the animals shuffled anxiously, hooves thudding, breath pluming in silver streams. The north door banged on a loose hinge, each slam a warning. Ethan shouldered into it, while Andrea latched the crossbar, her fingers numb and clumsy. They moved in a rough rhythm. He lifted, She braced. He tied. She hauled until the door held, and the barn quieted into animal sounds and wind hiss. Ethan leaned against a beam, catching his breath. "You shouldn't be good at this," he said, voice tight with cold. "It makes it harder to send you away." Andrea met his eyes in the lantern light, something raw opening inside her. "Then don't." His gaze flicked to her mouth, then away, as if even the thought was dangerous. "You make simple things complicated." "Maybe they were always complicated," she said. "We just spend years pretending otherwise." He pushed off the beam. "We should check the full stall." They moved down the aisle, lanterns swinging, shadows of horses stepping along the stall walls like delicate ghosts. At the end, a young mare stamped nervously, eyes rolling. Ethan peeled back the blanket and checked the latch. "She's due next month." Storms make them edgy. Andrea reached over the gate, palm open. The mare nosed her hand, warm velvet against cold skin. Without thinking, Andrea whispered, "It's all right. You're safe." When she looked up, Ethan was watching her with an expression she didn't recognize on him, something like astonishment, something like surrender. He took a step closer. The lantern threw an amber halo across his jaw, lit the snow dusting his coat, caught the fine tremor in the space between them. "Ethan," Andrea said, his name soft in the air, a question and an answer. He exhaled, and the sound carried years in it. "I don't know how to want you and still keep this place the way it needs to be. You don't have to choose tonight," she said. "Just don't send me away." A crack sounded from the far end of the barn, sharp and wrong. Ethan turned, lantern lifting. Another crack, louder, a beam shifting underweight, snow pushing where it shouldn't. The wind shoved hard against the roof, and something groaned high above them. "Out," Ethan said, voice suddenly all command. "Now." They ran for the door as snow hammered the roof. Behind them, wood screamed, and something heavy collapsed, sending up a choking cloud of dust and cold. Andrea stumbled. Ethan caught her elbow and pulled her forward. They burst into the night, the lanterns swinging, snow slicing their faces. He yanked the door closed, shouldered the latch into place, and held it there as the building shuddered. They stood pressed to the barn in the raging dark, breathless and shaking, the world reduced to wind and the thud of their hearts. Andrea turned to him, words rising out of fear and relief, and everything tangled between. And over the storm, the faint sound of a truck engine cut through the night, climbing the ranch road where no vehicle should have been able to, lights carving through white like a knife. The sound of the truck's engine sliced through the storm, low and insistent, headlights flashing against the snow-laden trees as it crawled up the ranch road. Andrea and Ethan stood pressed against the barn door, their breaths ragged in the cold, listening as the vehicle drew closer. "That's impossible," Ethan muttered. "No one could have made it up here in this weather." Andrea's heart sank, the truth forming before she even spoke it. "It's Alfred." The beam of headlights swept across the yard, catching the side of the house and the gleam of snow. Ethan's jaw tightened as the truck came to a stop, its tires spinning before catching on the ice. The driver's door opened, and Alfred White stepped out, wrapped in a dark wool coat, his polished shoes sinking awkwardly into the drifts. His face was sharp as ever, untouched by the storm, untouched by the land. "Wilson," he called, his voice carried by the wind. "We need to talk." Andrea froze, the name hitting her like a blade. Ethan turned to her, his expression hardening. "You knew he'd come," Ethan said. "I didn't," Andrea whispered, but the words felt weak against the truth that lingered in the cold air. Alfred trudged closer, shielding his face with one gloved hand. "You should have been back days ago. Instead, I find you hiding out here." His eyes flicked to Ethan, narrowing with disdain. "Mr. Walker, I presume." Ethan didn't move from where he stood. "And you must be the man trying to buy what isn't for sale." Alfred gave a thin smile. "Everyone has a price. Even you, not me." Ethan's voice cut through the storm like a strike of lightning. Andrea stepped forward quickly, her hand raised. "Alfred, stop." This isn't the way. Alfred's gaze sharpened on her. You've gone soft. I should have known better than to send someone who still believes in fairy tales. But you're not paid to feel. Andrea, you're paid to deliver. He pulled the contract from his coat pocket, the paper crisp and unblemished despite the storm. Get him to sign, now. Sophie's voice carried faintly from the porch. Daddy. Grace stood behind her, holding the little girl close, worry etched deep in her face. The storm whipped at their coats as they tried to see through the snow. Ethan moved instinctively, positioning himself between them and Alfred. Go back inside, he called to his mother and daughter. Now, Andrea's pulse thundered. She could feel the line being drawn in the snow, sharp and final. Alfred on one side, holding the contract that had brought her here. Ethan on the other, holding everything she had come to believe mattered more. Alfred, she said carefully, I can't do this. His head snapped toward her. What did you just say? I can't force him to sell. Not like this. Not ever. Her voice was steady now, though her hands shook. I'm not going to be part of this anymore. For a moment, Alfred simply stared at her, his face unreadable. Then, his expression twisted, anger flashing behind his eyes. Do you understand what you're throwing away? Your future, your career, the life you've worked for, all for a man you barely know. Andrea glanced at Ethan. He was still watching her, suspicion and pain carved deep into his features. But beneath it, there was something else, too, something fragile, something waiting. Yes, she said, turning back to Alfred. All of it. The storm roared around them, as if the land itself had heard her choice. Alfred's lips thinned. He tucked the contract back into his coat with sharp precision. You're making a mistake, and mistakes have consequences. He turned on his heel and trudged back to the truck. His shadow swallowed by the snow until only the taillights remained, vanishing down the road into the blizzard. For a long moment, no one moved. The storm raged on, the house creaked against the wind, and Andrea felt the weight of her decision sink into her bones. Finally, Ethan spoke. You just gave up everything. Andrea turned to him. Maybe I found something better. His jaw clenched, his eyes searching hers for lies. Whatever he saw there seemed to shake him, though he masked it quickly. He shook his head, muttering, You don't understand what you've done. Grace's voice carried from the porch. Both of you get inside before you freeze to death. They obeyed, trudging back into the warmth of the house. Sophie ran to Ethan, wrapping her arms around his waist. Daddy, who was that man? No one we need to worry about, Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. Andrea stood by the fire, her coat dripping onto the rug, her hands trembling as the heat finally reached her. She had never felt so lost and yet, never so certain. The contract, the bonus, the promotion, it was gone. She had chosen against all logic. Later that night, when the storm had quieted and Sophie was asleep, Andrea lingered by the window. Snow stretched across the fields like an endless ocean, moonlight glinting off its surface. Behind her, the floorboards creaked softly. Ethan stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Why did you do it? Andrea turned. Because I couldn't let him take this from you. From Sophie. From Grace. I couldn't be that person. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice was quieter this time. And what happens when the world realizes you walked away from everything, for nothing? Andrea stepped closer, her heart pounding. Then maybe nothing is exactly what I needed. Because here, it doesn't feel like nothing. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled softly, the storm eased against the windows, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, his defenses flickering like the flame in the hearth. He didn't step forward, didn't reach for her, but he didn't turn away either. And in that fragile pause, Andrea realized that though the storm outside was ending, the one inside had only just begun. The square had fallen silent. The cheerful hum of carols and laughter dissolved into whispers as Alfred White stood beneath the glow of the Christmas tree. His dark coat cutting a sharp figure against the snow. The townsfolk watched with wary curiosity, sensing the storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Andrea's pulse hammered in her ears. She had thought she was done with him, done with the life she had built around ambition and contracts. But Alfred wasn't the kind of man who let go. He advanced slowly, his gaze locked on her like a predator that had cornered its prey. "You've wasted enough time here," Alfred said, his voice low but carrying. "Come back to New York with me. We'll finalize this deal the right way. You can salvage your career, your reputation. Everything you've ever worked for is one signature away." Ethan moved between them, his stance solid, his tone sharp. "She's not going anywhere with you." Alfred's eyes flicked to him, disdain curling his mouth. "This doesn't concern you, Walker. She's my employee, and she knows what she owes me." Andrea stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I don't owe you anything, Alfred." "Not anymore," the crowd murmured. Grace appeared at the edge of the group, Sophie clinging to her hand, both watching with anxious eyes. Andrea felt the weight of their gaze, of Ethan's, of everyone who had become part of her unexpected world. Alfred laughed softly, though it carried no humor. "Do you even hear yourself? You've spent years fighting for a place in this industry. Do you think these people will give you that? Do you think this man can? He'll trap you here in the snow with chores and livestock, and when you realize what you've thrown away, it'll be too late." Andrea's throat tightened, but her words came clear. "You're wrong. They've given me something you never could. Belonging, trust, family." She lifted her chin. "I've been chasing the wrong things for too long, and I won't let you drag me back." Alfred's face hardened. "So you're willing to throw away a career that people would kill for? For what? Some fantasy about a rancher who doesn't even trust you?" Andrea felt Ethan stiffened beside her. She turned to him then, her heart in her throat. For all the walls he kept around himself, she needed him to hear her, to see her. "I didn't come here looking for you, Ethan. I came here for a deal, and I nearly ruined everything because of it. But I'm not that woman anymore. What I want now is to stay, if you'll let me. Not because Alfred pushed me here, not because of contracts or deadlines, because of you, because of Sophie, because of Grace, because this place feels like home." Ethan's jaw worked, his breath visible in the cold air. The silence stretched until Andrea thought she might break beneath it. But then his eyes softened, the steel giving way to something fragile and real. "You'd give up everything for this?" he asked quietly. Andrea nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "For you, for all of you." Yes. For the first time since she had met him, Ethan's walls cracked fully. He reached out, his rough hand taking hers, his grip strong and steady. "Then you already belong here." A ripple of warmth spread through Andrea's chest, stronger than any promise Alfred had ever dangled in front of her. Alfred scoffed, his voice sharp. "You'll regret this, Andrea. Mark my words." He turned on his heel, his polished shoes crunching against the snow as he stalked back toward his sedan. The car's taillights glowed red as it disappeared down the road, swallowed by the night. The square erupted in quiet applause and cheers, the townsfolk rallying around Andrea and Ethan, their voices rising like a tide of approval. Grace wiped at her eyes. Sophie clapped her hands and ran to Andrea, throwing her arms around her waist. "You're staying?" Sophie asked breathlessly. Andrea knelt, hugging her tightly. "If you'll have me." Sophie beamed, her face glowing brighter than the Christmas lights above. Ethan pulled Andrea to her feet, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, the crowd, the tree, the cold all of it, faded, leaving only the two of them. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle, reverent. "I've been afraid for so long," he murmured, "afraid of losing what little I had left. But with you, it doesn't feel like losing anymore. It feels like finding." Andrea's breath caught. And before she could answer, Ethan bent and pressed his lips to hers. The crowd cheered louder, but Andrea barely heard it. All she felt was the warmth of his kiss, the strength of his arms. and the certainty that for the first time in her life, she had chosen right. Christmas morning arrived, wrapped in stillness. The storm had long passed, leaving the ranch glistening beneath a clear sky. Frost clung to every branch, every fence post, every rooftop, and when the sun broke across the horizon, the world shimmered like glass. Inside the Walker house, the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. A fire crackled warmly in the hearth, stockings hung neatly on the mantel, and Sophie darted around in her pajamas, her laughter ringing through every room. Andrea stood in the kitchen beside Grace, helping to slice apples for a pie. Grace's hands were steady, her eyes bright with quiet pride. "It's been a long time since we've had this much life in the house on Christmas morning," she said. Andrea smiled softly. "Thank you for letting me be part of it." Grace's hand brushed hers, gentle and knowing. "You're not just part of it, Andrea. You belong here." Before Andrea could answer, Sophie burst into the kitchen, waving a ribbon in her hand. "Daddy says we can open presents now." The three of them moved into the living room, where Ethan was already waiting by the tree. His flannel shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his hair tousled, and his smile small but real lit up the room more than the twinkling lights strung on the branches. Sophie climbed into Andrea's lap as they settled on the floor. Together, they unwrapped simple gifts, handmade scarves, carved wooden toys, jars of preserves. Nothing extravagant, but everything chosen with love. Andrea's chest tightened with every moment, every laugh, every shared glance. When the last package was opened, Sophie clapped her hands. "Now we put the star on top." She held out the ornament she had shown Andrea days earlier, the snowflake with her mother's name written in faded ink. Ethan lifted her gently onto his shoulders, and Sophie placed it carefully at the top of the tree. The room fell quiet, the air heavy with memory and hope. Andrea felt tears sting her eyes, but they weren't born of sorrow. They were born of something deeper, something that felt like healing. Ethan lowered Sophie, who darted off to show Grace her new toy. For a moment, Andrea and Ethan stood side by side, watching the glow of the tree reflect off the window. Ethan spoke quietly, "Just for her. I never thought I'd find Christmas again. Not after Claire. I thought that part of me was gone forever." He turned, his gaze steady on her. "But then you showed up, and you've made this house feel alive again." Andrea's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to fall into your life like this." He reached for her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. Maybe that's exactly how it was supposed to happen. They stood together in the glow of the tree, the fire crackling, the sound of Sophie's laughter drifting around them like music. For the first time since she had stepped off the train into the snow, Andrea felt not like a visitor, but like a part of something unshakable, something she had never dared to hope for. As the morning stretched on, neighbors arrived at the ranch with baskets of food and small gifts, their boots crunching against the snow as they filled the house with cheer. Andrea helped Grace set the long table. The laughter of friends and family, mingling with the clink of dishes and the smell of roasted meat. When everyone was gathered, Ethan stood at the head of the table, Sophie beside him holding his hand. His eyes swept the room before settling on Andrea. "This year," he began, his voice carrying steady and clear, "we thought we'd be facing another Christmas with nothing but memories to hold on to. But life has a way of surprising us, and sometimes it gives us back more than we thought we'd ever have again." Andrea felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She met his gaze, and in it, she saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, something that made her believe in miracles again. After the meal, as twilight settled over the snowy fields, Andrea slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The sky was painted in streaks of purple and gold, the air still and cold against her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, drawing in the silence. Footsteps crunched behind her. Ethan appeared at her side, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I figured I'd find you out here." Andrea smiled faintly. "Just needed to take it all in. It feels unreal." He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You said once that you came here for control, for security. Do you still feel that way? Andrea shook her head slowly. No, I don't want control anymore. I want this. The mess, the uncertainty, the hard work, the joy. I want all of it. She looked up at him, her heart open. I want you. For a moment, the only sound was the distant call of a bird settling into the trees. Then Ethan reached out, cupping her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tear that had slipped free. He kissed her, slow and certain, sealing the words they hadn't yet spoken but both already knew. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Then stay here, with us. Not for a season, not for a deal. Stay for good. Andrea's breath caught, her heart surging. Yes, always. They stood there as the sky darkened, the lights of the house glowing warm against the snow, Sophie's laughter carrying through the night. And in that moment, Andrea knew she had finally found the one thing she had been chasing all her life, not success, not power, not control. She had found home. The ranch settled into quiet after the long day of celebration. Guests had gone home, leaving behind the echoes of laughter and the warmth of shared meals. Sophie had finally fallen asleep upstairs, clutching the small wooden horse ornament in her hands, her dreams carrying her into a world where Christmas would always mean family. Downstairs, the fire glowed low in the hearth. Andrea sat curled into Ethan's arm on the couch, Grace knitting slowly in her chair nearby. There was no rush, no pressure, no deadlines hanging over their heads, only the rhythm of crackling wood, the soft breath of a house finally at peace. Andrea closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence wash over her. She thought of the woman she had been when she stepped off the train into this snowbound world, sharp, determined, ready to trade human connection for a contract. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had left behind with the blizzard. Ethan's hand rested over hers, rough but steady. She looked at him and found in his eyes what she had been searching for all along: not wealth, not security, but a place to belong, a heart that matched her own. Grace's voice broke the stillness, soft and sure. Life has a way of giving back what it takes, if you're willing to open the door. Andrea smiled, her eyes glistening. Then I guess I was meant to get on that train. Ethan kissed the top of her head, his voice low. And I was meant to open the door. The fire popped, sending a spark upward, and Andrea felt the truth settle deep inside her. Sometimes the greatest miracles arrive not in the form of success or recognition, but in the quiet discovery of where you truly belong. And so the house grew still, wrapped in the glow of Christmas lights, holding inside it a family that was whole again. Outside, the snow stretched endlessly, silent and perfect, like a promise of forever. Sometimes we spend years chasing goals we think will make us whole: money, careers, recognition, only to realize that what our hearts long for most cannot be bought. Andrea's journey reminds us that love, trust, and belonging are the treasures worth fighting for. Thank you for staying with us through this story, for feeling every moment of hope, betrayal, and redemption along the way. Your presence here matters. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you'll be the first to hear the next tale we share. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a choice between ambition and love, between success and family? Share your story in the comments. Your words might inspire someone else watching tonight. When this video ends, I hope you'll stay with us a little longer. Another story awaits you here on our channel, one filled with its own secrets, struggles, and miracles. Until then, remember this: the greatest stories aren't written in contracts or careers. They're written in the hearts of those who dare to love. And this is what we believe at Lasting Tales. Some stories fade, but the ones born of love, they last forever.